Josephine Blackwood clutched her grandmother's handkerchief to her nose, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that still clung to the delicate fabric after all these years. The funeral home smelled like artificial roses and disappointment, a combination that stuck to the back of her throat like summer dust on a dirt road. Grandpa Elliot had always said he wanted to be buried under the ancient oak on his property, not packed away in some fancy box at Millerton's only funeral parlor. Looks like the prodigal granddaughter finally decided to show. Aunt Vivian's voice sliced through the quiet murmurs, sharp as a harvest blade. Too late to butter up the old man now, honey. Jo swallowed hard, her eyes finding her father's across the room. Daddy gave her that look, the one that said, "Let sleeping dogs lie," better than words ever could. Some feuds in Willow Creek ran deeper than the Chattahoochee in flood season. "Nice to see you too, Aunt Viv," Jo managed, her voice steadier than her hands. And the funeral director, bless his heart, had the timing of a broken clock, choosing that exact moment to announce they should all take their seats. Jo slipped into the back row, away from the hurricane that was the Blackwood family politics. Elliot James Blackwood had been the glue that kept them from tearing each other apart, and now he was gone. Gone like morning fog when the sun hits hard. The service dragged on with people Jo barely recognized sharing stories about a man she thought she knew. Grandpa Elliot in their memories was a pillar of the community, a businessman with integrity, a family man. Her grandpa had been all whiskers against her cheek and secret candy bars when Mama wasn't looking. But underneath that scratchy gray beard had been a shrewd mind that built the largest agricultural supply business in 3 counties from nothing but gumption and dirt under his fingernails. Vivian kept shooting looks back at Jo throughout the service, smug as a fox in a henhouse. Something wasn't right. Jo could feel it in her bones, the way Grandma used to say she could feel rain coming. After the final prayer, everyone shuffled toward the community room where platters of food waited, because that's what Southerners do with grief. They feed it until it's too full to make noise. Jo was halfway to her car, keys already in hand, when Mr. Abernathy, Grandpa's lawyer since before Jo was born, caught her elbow. "Miss Josephine, your grandfather specifically requested you attend the reading of his will, today, after the reception." Jo froze. "I didn't think—" "That's exactly what he thought you'd think." The old lawyer's eyes crinkled at the corners. Elliot was many things, but predictable wasn't one of them. Yet something about the way Mr. Abernathy said it made Jo's chest tighten. She nodded, pocketing her keys and heading back inside, where the smell of funeral flowers mixed with sweet tea and casseroles. Vivian cornered her by the deviled eggs. "Don't get your hopes up, Jojo." The childhood nickname sounded like an insult now. "I already cleaned out his vault last week. There's nothing left for you fair-weather relatives." Jo's cousin Trey appeared with a plate piled high with fried chicken. "Aunt Viv's been telling everyone who'll listen about her inheritance expedition. Says Grandpa gave her permission before he passed." "That true?" Jo asked, though she already knew the answer. Grandpa Elliot hated anyone touching his things. Wouldn't even let Grandma dust his office. "Truth's in the pudding, as they say." Vivian smiled, her lipstick creeping into the fine lines around her mouth. The reception crawled by like a wounded animal. Jo spent it dodging relatives she hadn't seen in years, all suddenly interested in her life in Atlanta. "Still taking pictures of other people living their lives?" Uncle Clarence asked, meaning her photography career. "When you gonna get married and have some babies?" From Great Aunt Pearl. The question stuck to her like burrs on a wool sock. 3 o'clock finally rolled around. The lawyer's office smelled of old books and lemon polish. Jo sat in a high-backed leather chair that creaked like an old porch swing whenever she moved. The family gathered, Daddy and his brothers, Aunt Vivian and her brood, cousins from as far as Savannah. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. "Before I begin, I must note that Elliot made changes to his will just 2 months ago." Vivian's penciled eyebrows shot up like startled caterpillars. "I'll begin with the primary bequests," Mr. Abernathy continued, pulling out reading glasses that magnified his eyes to owl-like proportions. "Elliot James Blackwood leaves his primary residence and 50 acres of adjoining land to his son, Thomas Blackwood." Daddy nodded solemnly. No surprise there. "The remaining agricultural land is to be divided equally among his sons. Blackwood Farm Supply business ownership transfers to Robert and William Blackwood jointly." Uncle Bobby and Uncle Will exchanged glances. Another expected development. "To my beloved granddaughter, Josephine Claire Blackwood." "What?" Vivian's voice cut through the room like a misplaced sneeze in church. "I leave the contents of the steel vault in my home office, as well as the sum of $200,000. The room went quiet as a tomb. Joe felt everyone's eyes boring into her like drill bits. And then Vivian laughed. A sound like ice cracking on a cold pond. Well, isn't that just precious? Too bad I already emptied that vault last Tuesday with his blessing. Showed me right where the key was kept and everything. Joe looked to Mr. Abernathy, whose face remained impassive as a tortoise. My father was on heavy medication, Daddy said quietly. He wasn't in his right mind those last few days. He knew exactly what he was doing, Vivian snapped back. Said it was high time the family treasures stayed with someone who cared enough to visit more than once a year. Joe felt her cheeks burn hot as August asphalt. She'd been busy building her career, true, but the real reason she'd stayed away was sitting right across from her, wearing knockoff pearls and a vindictive smile. But Mr. Abernathy wasn't finished. There is one final bequest, he said, adjusting his glasses. To my sister-in-law, Vivian Blackwood, I leave my collection of commemorative state quarters and my sincere hope that she will one day find contentment with what she has, rather than coveting what belongs to others. Vivian's face flushed red as a tomato left too long on the vine. That's it? After all I did for him, driving him to appointments, bringing groceries, and charging him for gas and groceries, Uncle Bobby muttered. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat again. There is a personal letter from Miss Josephine that Elliot asked me to deliver privately. As the family erupted into discussions around her, Joe felt a tap on her shoulder. Mr. Abernathy beckoned her to follow him into an adjoining office. Your grandfather anticipated some dramatics today, he said once they were alone. He leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. She took the wrong box. Joe blinked. What? The vault in Elliot's office. It's a decoy. Has been for years. A small smile played across his lips. Your aunt removed a collection of old tax returns and business receipts. Joe's mind reeled like a spring storm, chaotic and disorienting. Then what did Grandpa leave me? Mr. Abernathy handed her an envelope, yellow with age, her name written in Grandpa's shaky handwriting. Inside was a single key and a note. The real vault is behind the bookcase in the basement. Third shelf, pull the red dictionary. Something wild and hopeful sprouted in Joe's chest, growing fast as kudzu in July. The family meeting dissolved into squabbling that Joe barely heard. Her mind was already at Grandpa's house, wondering what secrets lay behind that bookcase. Daddy caught her eye as she slipped out, giving her a slight nod that said he'd handle things here. Joe's old Honda kicked up dust on the familiar road to the Blackwood homestead. The white farmhouse stood proud on its small hill, just like it had for the last 80 years. She parked beside Daddy's empty truck and used her childhood key to let herself in. The house smelled like Grandpa, pipe tobacco, though he'd quit smoking years ago, old books, and that particular scent of a home that's been loved for generations. Joe ran her fingertips along the wallpaper in the hallway, remembering how she used to count the flowers as she walked to the kitchen. Once upstairs, she couldn't resist peeking into Grandpa's office. The room looked ransacked, drawers hanging open, papers scattered, the small vault in the corner standing with its door ajar. Vivian hadn't even tried to hide her treasure hunt. Joe felt a flash of anger hot as lightning. This was Grandpa's sanctuary, the place where he'd taught her to play chess and told stories about when Daddy was a boy. Taking a deep breath that shuddered on its way out, Joe turned and headed for the basement stairs. They creaked in the exact same places they always had. Third step, seventh step, second from bottom. The cool, dimly lit space below smelled of earth and old wood. The bookcase stood against the far wall, a behemoth of oak that Grandpa had built himself back when his hands were steady and his back was strong. Joe ran her fingers along the spines until she found it. Webster's Dictionary, bound in faded red cloth. Yet she hesitated, her fingers trembling like cottonwood leaves in a breeze. What if this was Grandpa's last lesson? That family meant more than material things. What if the vault was empty? Oh, for heaven's sake, Josephine, she muttered to herself, sounding so much like Grandma that she almost looked over her shoulder. She pulled the book. A soft click, then the sound of gears turning inside the wall. The entire right side of the bookcase swung forward an inch. Joe pulled, revealing a narrow space behind and, just as promised, a steel vault built into the wall itself. The key from the envelope fit perfectly. Inside was a single wooden box, about the size of a bread loaf, with intricate carvings on its surface. Joe recognized it from Grandpa's bedside table. She'd always assumed it held cufflinks or maybe Grandma's jewelry. And maybe it had, once. But now, as Joe lifted the lid with hands that didn't feel like her own, she found something entirely different. Papers, dozens of them. Stock certificates, property deeds, a small leather pouch that clinked when she touched it. Heart hammering, Joe carried the box upstairs to the kitchen table where the light was better. The pouch contained 5 gold coins, each in a protective case, clearly valuable. The stock certificates were for companies she recognized from the news. Blue chip investments made decades ago. The property deeds showed land holdings in 3 states. At the bottom of the box lay another envelope with her name on it. This letter was longer. Josephine, my sparrow. He'd always called her that. Said she had eyes that missed nothing, just like the little birds. But before she could read further, the front door slammed open. Vivian stood there, face twisted in fury, clutching her car keys so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "So it's true," she hissed, eyes locked on the open box. "That double-crossing old man had a second vault." Jo stood, instinctively placing herself between her aunt and Grandpa's legacy. "This isn't yours, Aunt Viv. Everything in this house should have been mine. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who put up with his cranky demands and endless stories about the good old days." "You stayed because you were counting the days until he died," Jo said quietly. "He knew that." Vivian lunged forward, hand outstretched toward the box. "You have no idea what I sacrificed." "I reckon we all know exactly what you sacrificed, Vivian," came Daddy's voice from the doorway. He stood there with Uncle Bobby and Mr. Abernathy, his face hard as January ground. "Your integrity, for starters." Mr. Abernathy stepped forward, clearing his throat in that way he had. "Mrs. Harris, I should inform you that removing items from the estate before proper legal disbursement constitutes theft. The items you took from Mr. Blackwood's office vault should be returned immediately." Vivian's face went from angry red to ashen gray faster than storm clouds rolling in. She looked from face to face, seeking an ally and finding none. "This family," she spat finally. "You all think you're better than me. Always have." "No, Viv," Daddy said softly. "We just thought better of you than this." The aftermath was quieter than Jo expected. Vivian left, tail between her legs, muttering about ungrateful relatives. The men went out to the porch, giving Jo space to finish reading Grandpa's letter. "I've watched you grow into a woman with both talent and backbone, rare qualities these days. You remind me of your grandmother in all the ways that matter. She would have been proud to see how you've made your own way, just like I am. This wealth isn't a reward for visiting more or loving harder. It's an investment in the future I see in your eyes. Don't let anyone make you feel you don't deserve good things, Sparrow. Some folks measure worthiness by proximity. I measured it by character. Take these old treasures and build something new. Come home when you want, not when you ought. All my love, always. Grandpa."